Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to another great episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Cherokee Boose, and if you've been following along, you know that we've been looking at our phases, our Project Plus, CompTIA's Project Plus. We've been distinguishing our different project phases. Our last episode, we were able to get through the first phase, so hopefully we'll go ahead and continue that here. Maybe we'll get through a couple more, and we have Mr. Ronnie Wong to go ahead and continue with our Project Plus today.
All right, well, thank you, Cherokee, for having me back on the show as we continue on to take a look at this second phase of what we actually need to understand in terms of project management, formal project management, that is. And what we talk about in that episode, as Cherokee has mentioned, the idea of the initiation phase. Now we are moving into the planning phase. Now remember that when we start talking about planning, none of this can actually happen without that initial charter. Okay? Without the project charter, we are not authorized to continue to go ahead and plan. Can you plan and do all that stuff that you want to? Yes, you can, but without any authorization, it doesn't mean that it's actually going to lead you anywhere. And so this will actually be a project that you actually kind of spend your own time in trying to plan out and do everything that you need to. So when we start to take a look here at the idea of planning, well, it's one of the things that I am not really good at. I am not a great planner myself. Cherokee, how are you at planning things?
I have lists for lists.
So you are actually someone that is fairly organized, that likes to plan things, which is great. That's something that everybody in this world needs, because it counteracts people like me that's not good at planning, because I think I can keep everything in my head, and when it comes down to it, I might be able to keep a maximum of 4 or 5 things in my head. Usually after that, I'm kind of lost. But the idea of projects, though, remember, is that even though I might think, oh, it shouldn't take any time to do any of this, well, planning is actually what allows us to find the details behind what needs to be done, and planning is very important because that is what helps to keep us within our project constraints of time, of the idea of cost, as well as requirements for our project. Without that idea of the planning phase, we are kind of done. Now, just when I say that, I did mention earlier, though, that we can just kind of jump into it a lot of times if we don't think about this idea here and just jump right into the execution phase. But when we do that, there's a lot of things that we might miss, and when we start actually implementing formal projects, we want to make sure that we cover all of our bases because of all those elements that are actually in play and how expensive projects can grow without that. So what we want to do is make sure that we do hit some of the key elements and that we understand how important planning really is.
Yeah, I could see the excitement of wanting to get the project done, but instead of just going ahead and getting started, do we really need to take such a surgical approach and, you know, go ahead and work our way through this planning phase?
Yes and no, of course. Once again, the answers are always going to be that way, and anything as you get into the technical skill set of things, there are configurations that you have to do exactly right. But in project management, every project, because every project manager is different, will take forms differently. So some people like the idea of just saying, here's what needs to be done, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Cherokee, and you just tell me how much you need, and then we're done. Well, if that's true, I don't really have to worry about the idea of planning. But there's actually comes a problem with that. So let's say that what happens is exactly that. So I say, Cherokee, here it is. I'm going to turn over this portion of the project to you. I'm not going to worry about planning. I'm not going to worry about, you know, thinking how this is going to go on. Cherokee, you just tell me how much time you need. Okay, and so Cherokee says 6 weeks. Okay, so now all of a sudden in week number 2, okay, I come back to Cherokee and I say, Cherokee, how are we doing on the project? And she goes, what project? What are you talking about? Well, now I'm a little bit more concerned.
Project.
Yeah, oh, that project. You know, the one that we talked about a couple of weeks ago where I said, you're going to do this and I'm handing this off to you. And when Cherokee comes back to me with that, well, I'm a little bit more worried at that point because I didn't do the planning that I needed to, and now all of a sudden, I don't know where Cherokee left off, if she did anything at all, or whether or not she's just kind of abandoned the project because either it got, you know, a little bit more that, you know, it's like, oh, I'm just waiting on this other person to finish their particular work. I don't know what's happening at this point. So Cherokee could get upset when I go, Cherokee, you're supposed to work on this, and go, well, I'm not going to work on your stupid project, Mr. Ronnie. That's done. You know, and she walks off of that project. And I mean, if that happens, and I'm of course using a ridiculous example, we're professionals, we're not going to say anything like that, at least I hope that that wouldn't happen. But what we're saying is what? Is that, look, if that happens, right, and I don't have the planning that I need done, well, how can I now go and turn to somebody else in my organization and say, here's where I need to pick up, okay? Here's what needs to be done, you know, here's where we got to at this particular point. So if we can, especially when we start implementing formalized types of projects within our organizations, planning is key. This is where, as a project sponsor, as a project manager, I'm going to take all my time and detail to lay out. Now, what I'm not laying out, right, is every single skill, every single technique that needs to be done. I'm laying out how, in project management terms and planning, how those things are going to be managed. What's going to be managed? My schedule. Okay. What else is going to be managed? My resources. What else is going to be managed? The requirements have to be managed as well. I need to make sure that all of those things are actually available at the right time. I need to make sure that we have elements that are actually in play, that I know what the environmental factors are, what else is actually happening out there to ensure that we get everything. So if I don't spend the time in planning and I just go, it'll get done when it gets done, well, I'm no longer in a project. I'm just kind of held at the whim of whoever chooses to finish something and whoever doesn't. And so that can be a little bit more disconcerting if you're actually having to produce some type of deliverable out of this here. So the planning is one of the most important elements that we can actually do. So it does take a bit of skill, and the great thing is project managers do not necessarily have to do the planning phase alone. Some project managers love this phase because it really does allow them to essentially set up a chessboard of all the things that need to be done and considered, and they essentially play that idea of here's all the elements that need to be included here, and we're going to start writing our project plan and getting everything set up the way that we need to. And they like the alone time in doing it. Some project managers are a bit more collaborative in the very fact that they may call together some of the roles that we have talked about in the previous episode, such as a project coordinator and a project scheduler, to start to actually say, here's some of the things that we need to consider, and now they bounce off of each other as far as ideas go to become inputs to say, oh yes, we also need to make sure that we consider this as well. So when you start to actually do this level of planning that you're talking about, the details are not so much about what exactly how exactly everything needs to be done, as much as how do we manage to ensure that those things get done at the proper timing that they need to be done as well, and that we have enough resources on hand to complete them. So that is what we're really talking about when it comes down to the planning aspects of what we're actually seeing here too. Okay? So planning is exactly like it sounds, right? Is that instead of doing the actual work of the project right now, we are trying to lay out, right, those details that we need to do so. As a project manager, we're not micromanaging, so what we're doing is we're saying, here's how this entire project is going to be managed, and we may even pick out who is actually going to be managing with us and what, of course, needs to be done, but the details we're kind of leaving aside, and that means that we have to actually have everything else set up to ensure that we can see where the progress is happening and the other things that we actually need to do. So let's talk about some of those elements. So Cherokee, from that description that I did, I know is long and drawn out, and you're probably going, oh my gosh, he's going to drone on for about 5 more minutes, and I can, but I'm not going to do that. If I were to ask you, what would you expect to see as an output from something like the planning? What are some of the elements? You've had some project training.
I would probably hope for some kind of timeline, like a chronological order that would, kind of set some toll gates or checkpoints for any kind of specific events along that chronological order there.
Yeah, so when it comes down to it, a schedule of some sort,
Exactly.
Actual
Imagine.
scheduling here is what we would actually expect to see somewhere along the way. Now, scheduling, remember, really, even though the time element is heavy, the time element is not the only thing that we have to worry about. Don't get me wrong, time is important. And remember that a project is a temporary endeavor, right? The problem with that idea of temporary endeavor is that we always think about, well, a very short amount of time, okay? Well, in this particular idea of temporary, what we mean is that there's a solid beginning, there's a true established beginning, and there's a true established endpoint to our project. but it doesn't tell you what the time is in between that. So in other words, it might be a temporary endeavor that lasts 6 months. It might be a temporary endeavor that lasts a decade. Well, you might go, what the heck would last a decade? Well, think about the idea of building roads and bridges, okay?
Yeah.
So those are actually projects that happen over decades in time. And you want to talk about even years in time, you can think about the idea of the Great Wall of China. It took place over 1,000 years. I mean, you got to realize that wall was going to end at some point, but they didn't mind taking 1,000 years to complete the wall. So in that sense, that's what you have, is that it's still going to be what started. It's still going to end at some point, but that time in between. And what we have to do with the scheduling is figure out how to manage that time in between so that we have the right resources when we need them, as far as human resources as well as material resources. We have the amount of money that we need, right? The scheduling has to be there. You might find out something in a company that in the first quarter, okay, of your company, because you actually had a great form, the last quarter of the previous year, you might find out you have cash reserves that are on hand. You go, yes, I can do this much. Then all of a sudden in the third quarter, you might be going, whoa, wait a minute, we got to kind of stretch out every single dime that we can and see if we can make that dime turn into 15 cents, okay? So you might find that out, and that's why scheduling is actually very important for our planning processes here, when we can take a look at some of those elements as well, and even things like resources that are available. You might find out that a piece of machinery that you've seen sitting there, that you need to actually have for your project, go, man, I've driven by this, it's been there for 6 months, it's not moved, and that's perfect. Then you go and try and rent it, and all of a sudden you realize something. You mean it's rented every week for the summer? I mean, how in the world is that possible? It's been sitting there for 6 months. Well, nobody needed it in those previous 6 months. So sometimes you do have to actually figure out that scheduling idea, and that's what planning helps you to really be able to do there, is to make sure that you manage the time constraints of the project itself and that you can schedule the work exactly when it needs to be done. So yeah, scheduling is a big one that we also have to think about too, okay? Now, there's also another thing that more technically that we tend to get to as far as project management goes. Along with the schedule, you might hear the term WBS. And now, when you hear that term, Cherokee, WBS, what do you think that actually means? That's an acronym for something in project management.
Well, that's a little unfair because I have my Six Sigma training, so I actually looked at our work breakdown schedules. So.
Yeah, the work breakdown schedule, the work breakdown structure, either one, they both actually work for us in the way that we need. And this is something that project managers are really trying to get done during the planning, okay? So if I were to say something, and a project that I worked on several years ago, okay, is this, okay? So Cherokee, I was supposed to migrate 50 users over from regular desktop computers to thin client computers.
Okay.
Okay, so that was a project I worked on. Now, when I say Cherokee, okay, and let's say that we're going to do this project again. I say, Cherokee, we're going to migrate all of the actual users at IT Pro TV that's working. We're going to migrate them from regular laptops or desktop computers to thin clients, okay? Now, when I say that, that's kind of generic, right? I might say, Cherokee, do it. And you might now start to go, all right, I can do that. But what do you think some of the elements that are involved in that idea that we have to actually do if we were to migrate something like regular desktops into thin clients here? Okay.
Compatibility, budget, time constraint. Are we going to have any downtime because of this? Who are the employees that we need to go ahead and migrate? Those are just a few that come to mind.
See, and I threw that at Cherokee, so I'm really putting her on the spot. She's like, oh crud, I don't think I should have done that. But no, that's perfectly fine, because what I wanted to realize, what I wanted her to realize, and she does know this, what I want you to realize is this, right? Is that even though I, as a project manager, might say something like that, migrate these users over to thin clients here, okay? Does that mean I know exactly what steps need to take place to do that? No, it really doesn't. So what I need to do during the planning phase, if I'm the project manager, is at least figure that out, okay? Is to break down that requirement, right? The overall scope, the overall requirements into work units, okay?
So Ronnie, could I go ahead and hire a consultant to kind of fill in any kind of technical gaps that I may not have as a project manager?
Absolutely, yeah. It just depends on what the scope allows and whether or not you're actually allowed to use your resources in that particular way. Sure, but that's something that we can do. Now, you might say, well, Ronnie, you kind of went a long way to explain something. So what does a work breakdown structure do? A work breakdown structure essentially allows us to do what I was describing here, is to take what the overall goal was, right? Whatever we actually thought was the end result, and break them down into workable or work units that now can be assigned as tasks or as activities, if you're from the PMBOK world, since they don't use the word task, they use the word activities, to activities that now can be assigned to Cherokee or assigned to Ronnie so that we can actually accomplish those activities. Now for me, I know what the end goal is. Cherokee knows what the end goal is. Migrate all the users over to, thin clients. Okay, so that makes sense. But as far as breaking down that unit, I may not understand it until we do talk to a consultant or we talk to somebody else that has expertise in it. And once we do that, we can now start breaking it down and start assigning what we call a work breakdown structure number to it if we want to. So let me show you an example of what I'm talking about here, and then we'll show you the way that this breaks down a little bit more. So here is just a basic example. Okay, so here it is. My first task, the overall general task, right, was to migrate users to thin clients here. Okay, now at this point, okay, Cherokee started naming some of the different things that could actually happen here. Compatibility testing might be something else. Putting the hardware in place, removing old hardware, whatever it might be, right? So we can actually have those units here. And now notice that I had 1.0 as just a number. Now you might be wondering, what the heck is the number about? Well, that's going to be a number that we can use to trace all the way through our entire project, whether we're talking about distributing resources or we're assigning resources here. We can refer to these numbers to help us out. Okay?
Ronnie, I really like how you have it in a graph format, and I've seen it done a couple different ways where people just go ahead and take like a Word document and kind of use the tab indents to go ahead and use those numbers, but I think that graphs just kind of bring a little something extra to the table, especially if you have a presentation and need to prove a point.
Yeah, if you're in a hurry, okay, and I really mean this, if you are in a hurry, breaking it down the way that Cherokee described here, which is just using either the tabs or actually just using a line document, paper to write it out, it works exactly the way that you need to. But if you really want to make a point that you're actually taking this and breaking it down, the graphical way is what people really do understand at the most generic level. Okay? They can see the entire project generically at this point and graphically when they realize here's the overall goal. Okay? We're migrating users to thin clients here. And what we actually have at least at the beginning here is we know we need to install some hardware. Okay? We know that there's going to be testing going on. We know that there's other elements that need to be in place to make everything happen the way that we need to. But even at this particular point, this level up here, so you might see it actually breaks down into multiple levels, okay? Where it says installing hardware, that's a little bit generic. You don't know what hardware, you don't know exactly what needs to be installed. In other words, you don't even know what type of thin client I'm talking about. You don't know what type of servers I'm talking about. You don't know anything that I'm talking about using that example, right? So it's right here where Cherokee was asking, could I actually hire now a consultant to come in and help me to flesh this out? Absolutely. I, as a project manager, do not necessarily need to know that second level, okay? But the key here is to understand that whatever the last level is, okay, that is going to be our workable and our assignable unit is what we're going to have, okay? So in this sense here, we're actually now have it at the third level. Here's the first level. Here's the second level. Here's the third level here. So this is just a brief overview. We're going to go over this a little bit more in depth later on. But at this point here, this is now a workable level. So you can see, like for this example, right? Can I get people installing the servers and rack? Yeah, that actually is a workable unit. And I can now assign a time element to it. I can assign resources to it. I can even assign how much it's going to cost if I know what the servers actually are and what else needs to go on. At this point, there could be even sub-levels under here. We're actually talking about installing the operating system onto the servers, making the terminal server configured the way that it needs to. You name it, all that can be broken down even into more. But this is my last assignable unit. And at that point, Cherokee can say, I've got a team working on that. Okay? And then she, at that point, can actually break that down into what the team needs to do on her own when she actually gets that top level done. So that's the idea here, is that this is normally a graphical display as well, and this numbering system just helps us to keep accounting straight and being able to refer to the proper number when sometimes these particular descriptions, they tend to start sounding alike. Like notice like 1.13 and 1.14, I begin with setup. set up, and then you might find out it's something like set up end user thin clients, and then the second one is set up end user thin client applications on the desktop, and also it just gets muddled, printers and whatever it might be, and so the numbers really do help us to distinguish those different work units out, and so that is normally one of the outputs that we also see along with the scheduling. Okay.
All right.
All right, so the other thing that, of course, that we have to think about here, of course, is going to be who is going to work on the project itself, okay? Now, this comes down to, of course, managing the resources, not only who is going to work on it, but also a couple of different resources, and we're going to get into this a little bit more in depth, but we'll at least cover a little bit here. Resources break down into, well, 3 different elements, right? There, of course, is a regular human resource, people that are going to work on the project. Whatever it might be, laborers, or they might be designers, they might be integrators, whatever it might be. This is definitely some type of human resource that we are going to have. But it can also be, of course, something like a piece of equipment, okay, that we end up using. Okay? Now, that equipment might actually be a rental of some sort where we do use it for a little bit of time, or it might be a piece of equipment that we buy. Okay, because, there's like, look, it's not for rent. If you want to use it, you have to buy it, is what we saw there. And then there can also be what we call material resources as well. Now, when it breaks down into the idea of material resources, that is something that is going to be consumed in the making of whatever our work is to be done. So, for example, if you're actually going to be building, let's say, a table of some sort, right? My material resource would be the wood and whatever other overlays might actually be there to build that table. Okay, that's going to be used up, but the ultimate product is going to be what? A table. Okay, but if I were to rent a piece of equipment, well, I could actually do that, rent the equipment, and that would be fine for us to do that, and I could use that up and then return that when I need to, or if I have to buy it, that's fine. But just kind of realize that those are the resources that we're generally talking about. We need to plan for those resources, whether those resources are available. You might find something out that in terms of human resources, they might actually be things like contractors, like what Cherokee was mentioning, where they're available for this week, but they're not available today. Okay? You might find out that there's other reasons why you might choose one resource over the other, which is, hey, this particular resource, as far as human resources go, has never let me down. This guy has kind of been 50-50 here at things I've been pleased about when I've worked with him, and there's other times where I haven't been so pleased. And so you might choose to wait a little bit longer to work with the guy that you've actually trust a little bit more to do everything that they need to. So there's a lot of planning that has to go on, and it might be where you're saying, look, it's going to make me wait an extra 3 days to do it, but I know something that when it's done and when it's finished, that's exactly what I'm going to have is the product that I'm actually pleased with. And this is something that I used to do as a diesel mechanic as well, is that we tried to use a lot of local places to help us to go ahead and clean up the block when we rebuild engines. And we used a lot of different shops to help us out. But in the end result, sometimes they were good, sometimes they left sand, sometimes they left little pieces of whatever it is left on the block itself. But there was always one company that we said, when we got it back, even though it took longer because there was a longer line for it, it always was ready to go back in when we needed it to, and we could build that thing back up. So we always waited the extra day or the extra 3 days before we could get it, because we realized that if we needed it and we needed it done right, it was going to be that shop that we had it.
Falling back on your...
We get a work breakdown schedule, or work breakdown structure is what we also end up seeing. We start to be able to figure out all the resources that we need. And when we figure out those resources, it's not enough just so that I have them in my head as a project manager. I need to make sure that I register them down. In other words, I write them down and I contact them and say, hey, are you going to be available here and here and here for this if it's up to me? Or I might have a contact person where I know exactly how I can do that. And so there is something formally in project management that they call a resource register that allows you to do that. And of course, there can be in-house resources versus outside resources, and we're going to get into all that a little bit later on in another episode. but just kind of realize that there's a lot of planning that goes on
Yeah.
just in the stages that we see right there.
I can't even wait to go ahead and book a hair appointment. All the good ones are always filled up, right? So you do definitely, especially when it comes to your business, have to take that extra step to make sure that you book the good ones ahead of time.
Yeah, when it comes down to hair appointments, I do the same thing, Cherokee. Yeah, no, not really. But overall, though, yeah, you can see this. That it's the same idea, is that you kind of know who you trust. You kind of know what's actually going to happen here. Now, this is where the project manager's expertise and skill really does come into play. Right here is during the project planning phase, and this is where he is kind of the master of his domain in everything that he does here, because that's what he's trained to do, is to figure all this stuff out and help us out. So normally when you start to see this, what does the project manager end up, knowing from doing all this stuff? Well, one, he now gets a detailed understanding from the planning, okay, of the risks, the detailed risks that are in play on your project. You might find out that a project can be delayed very easily because there's only one resource available, or that you might find out something. If you have everything timed right, everything will go perfectly, okay? But if you don't have it timed right, you've got to wait 6 months before it can be done. Now you might be wondering, what in the world would cause anything like that? Well, think about the difference between, hurricane season and non-hurricane season, and what that might bring to you, especially here on the East Coast as far as recently goes. But in places that have these annual rainfalls that, let's say, 15, 20 inches, maybe even higher, well, you might find out something. Yeah, that truck can't really leave if they don't have a road that's actually there. So it always reminds me as I watch some of these TV shows. So there's something called Ice Road, and I'm pretty sure, Cherokee, you haven't watched Ice Road Truckers before, have you?
I've seen some previews.
Well, Ice Road Truckers is actually a great example, right? They can only ship things up to those very remote regions up there because a lake freezes over, okay? And they're literally driving 18-wheelers over this ice road that they've actually had. Well, once spring comes around, guess what? The road is gone and it's a lake. So you got to realize that there's a bunch of timing that's involved in that, and understand the risk. If it doesn't get up there, that means it's next spring before it can, or next winter, before it starts again, where they can actually drive on that road for the 2 months that it's open, during that freeze. So, I mean, that's a lot of pressure to realize that all the equipment that you have.
Business in
that's
that
it.
sense.
Yeah. So detailed risk is something that a project manager will end up getting out of the planning, is what they'll see. Okay. The other thing, of course, is that the planning always is with the idea of understanding those project constraints in their mind, right? So they understand what the requirements are, and they always plan according to those. They don't just sit there and go, I don't care what the cost is. I don't care that they want this done in this particular amount of time. I don't care that it actually requires this. This is what I'm going to do. Project manager doesn't think like that. At least hopefully they don't think like that. But they'll get this from the planning, right? They'll actually be able to plan with this idea in mind. The other thing, of course, is that as you work with different resources and different people, there has to be an established method of communication. And that's going to be true, okay? What you don't want is there being two official or three, let's say one official method and then three unofficial methods that they swear by, right? So one of the examples that we can give here is that, we say, here it is. If you get an email from me, take that as being I said it directly to you, okay? Here's what it needs to be done. And then here it is, Ronnie comes around the corner and goes, hey, Cherokee just told me here's what needs to be done. And now you're like, well, that contradicts that email that that I just got from Ronnie, whatever it might be, from Cherokee. And so Ronnie's telling me something different. And I'm saying, I swear to you, this is what Cherokee told me.
Yeah, you might even want to go ahead and set some kind of time limit to delineate when you expect a response from some kind of communication like that as well.
Yeah, and that's all part of that planning, that communication plan that's actually in place that they really have to develop to do that. So that's all a part of it. The other thing, of course, are procurement plans. Who are they going to buy from? How do they get the equipment that they need, or how are they getting the, whatever resources that they need? It might actually be kind of, you go, oh, this is neat. They're going to airdrop it from one of those drones at Amazon. And then, they airdrop it, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, this was supposed to be very sensitive, fragile equipment. And then there it is. It's dropped on your doorstep, and it looks like that the box literally was dropped. You're probably not so happy about it. So you establish those particular types of procurement methods and plans here to make sure that you get the equipment in the way that you need them. and that you get them on time, you get them the way that you want to get them as well. And of course, there has to be some type of formalized change management plan, okay? So nobody gets to make changes in a project, okay? And that's part of the planning without actually going through a change management plan, okay? So just because I go, you know, that doesn't look right, let me tweak that setting over there, okay? That's not something that I should be doing on myself, for myself, without authorization. So that's the key here, right? If it's not authorized to do it, we leave it alone. We can submit some type of management change that we need to, but remember, we don't just go, I wonder if this actually makes a difference if I move this lever over here to over here, and we'll just leave that for 24 hours and see what happens. You can do some of
Especially in
that.
certain industries, nuclear industry, or any kind of any bodies of, you know, that have some regulations that they need to adhere to. That's a serious violation.
Yeah, I think that's only true if you don't stay at a Holiday Inn Express, if I remember the commercials correctly. But overall, though, yeah, you can see that, you know, stuff like that, as well as things like budget. Okay, so all this comes underneath that management idea, and the project manager needs to make sure that they establish what they need to. And then, of course, the roles that they have at the end here. Okay, the project manager needs to, of course, keep stakeholders informed how this planning is going, and make sure that everything is actually going to direct them towards the goal of completing the project as well. And then, of course, has some tactic, has some strategy that they have ready to go when the planning is actually done and when it gets signed off. Now, just when they finish that signing phase, remember that once they have all that, right? This is where we go back to what Cherokee was talking about, like a go or a no-go type of decision that has to be done. There's going to be these things along the way, especially in the scheduling, but before that, right, all the planning here, okay, you might actually do incremental checks along the way where you say, all right, we planned out the first month of it. Let's make sure that we go and we review this, and we make a decision on whether or not we're actually going to proceed on with more planning or not. You can even do it at that phase if you want to. But it's at the end of the planning phase that everybody's on board with the plan, and if they are, you get the project sponsor maybe to go ahead and approve and say, yes, we are a go to continue forward, or you might actually get that project manager say, or the project sponsor, excuse me, to say, no, we shouldn't proceed on with this, the planning is not where it needs to be. So you will find that out in one way or the other, but just kind of realize that the planning is by far one of the most detailed, but one of the most important things that you and I will do as a project manager.
Ronnie, I think you've given us a lot of information to go off of here for our project planning phase. This is one of the most in-depth phases, so stay tuned with us, guys. We're going to cover the rest of them here coming up, and hope to see you. I appreciate you guys tuning in today. I'm Cherokee Boos.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
Signing off with IT Pro TV. Guys, have a great day.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.